It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster for Prime Minister's Questions. Joining me, Conservative Brexiteer MP Peter Bone, Labour's Stephen Kinnock, Henry Newman from Open Europe, a think tank focusing on the relationship of UK and the EU after Brexit, and the Financial Times' political correspondent Laura Hughes. There was lots of excitement in the Commons last night.
The ayes to the right, 317. The noes to the left, 301.
Theresa May got parliamentary backing to rewrite her Brexit deal, and her supporters are confident she can persuade the EU.
The backstop will have to change, and the Prime Minister will be negotiating with our European partners to get the very best deal for Britain.
And are you confident she'll make those changes?
Absolutely.
That's not how they see it across the Channel.
The withdrawal agreement negotiated by the EU and the UK is the best deal possible. It is not up for renegotiation.
And also, we'll be talking to the Labour MP and new mum, Tulip Siddiq, who made history last night. Let's take a look at the front page of the Daily Mail. It says, Theresa's triumph. Peter Bone, do you agree? Was it a victory for Theresa May or not?
Well, you can't argue with the headlines right, because you've had 2 weeks ago she had the worst Commons defeat ever, and last night she turned it into a victory where she got Remainers and Brexiteers all to vote in the same lobby. Very successful.
Stephen?
It's just more fantasy politics. The EU is not going to reopen the withdrawal agreement. The backstop is what it is. And so all this is another 2 weeks of purgatory whilst she goes off cap in hand to Brussels. More humiliation for our country. And she will come back on the 13th of February. We'll be back to square one.
Henry?
I think it's quite a big breakthrough, actually. It's the first time the Commons has decisively voted for a form of a negotiated deal. They sent a signal that they don't want the backstop. Fair enough, we've been warning that the backstop wasn't going to work in its current form for a long time. But we also saw Jeremy Corbyn humiliated and forced back to negotiate with the Prime Minister, even though the Prime Minister's position didn't change at all. And crucially, she didn't lose control of the Commons. The Commons wasn't able to either force her to put a series of votes down on different Brexit options, which could have led to more unicorn chasing, and they didn't demand that she had to go and beg for an extension to Article 50. So she stayed in control and she stayed on the pitch.
Laura?
It's a victory of sorts for now, for 24 hours, because yes, you're right, the government backed an amendment and it passed by 16 votes, but it still passed. And then you had Parliament expressing their will against a no deal, but not voting for measures that would actually stop a no deal for now. I say for now because actually in reality what she's done is she's bought herself 2 weeks, and I think we're probably going to be back where we were yesterday in 2 weeks' time, and nothing will really have changed unless, of course, the EU do give something considerable.
Peter, is your support now unconditional?
Unconditional for a proper Brexit on lines with the Prime Minister has promised.
And what is that exactly?
Well, she's always said, to summarise, that we would end the free movement of people. We wouldn't spend billions and billions of pounds to the EU each and every year.
That's in the deal currently.
We'll make our own. No, not each and every year. That's a one-off. Well, it's a payment over a period of time which is limited. And we make our own laws in our own country, judged by our own judges. Now, if she can achieve that, then she'll want to get my support, but she'll get the country's support.
So it's not just about the backstop for you?
Oh, because it's not about the backstop, but if you can, the problem with the backstop was it kept us in a situation that was actually worse than being in the EU, because we'd be indefinitely, possibly, tied to the EU and no control over the laws.
Right, but let's just be sort of clear for the viewers. I've used that expression, that hackneyed expression. What is it that you want Theresa May to say when she goes to Brussels?
Well, what she said in the Commons, she said that she would reopen the withdrawal agreement, so renegotiation, so that's clear, she said that she would come back to something that's legally binding. She would strengthen her negotiating team, which is code for saying Ollie Robbins will be pushed back, the civil servant who did the original agreement was so heavily rejected. And if she can achieve all those things, then there's a possibility of, well, not a possibility, it probably will be passed by Parliament. The problem is we don't know whether the EU will buy into that. Right,
and if they don't, you won't back the deal?
No, that's not true, because really, though we talk about Sir Graham Brady's amendment, it was actually the Kit Malthouse compromise where he got leading Remainers and leading Leavers to come up with a plan. And if the first bit, i.e. the backstop, can't be renegotiated, there's a second part, which is actually a managed no deal. So there's a plan A and a plan B, depending on how the EU reacts.
So it's reopening the withdrawal agreement, removing the backstop, replacing it with alternative arrangements. What are those?
Well, that's what has to be negotiated.
All right, so you signed up to a compromise, to an amendment for something that you don't yet know what it is.
Well, I think a lot of people, before Kit Malthouse brought everyone together with a plan, I think the Brady Amendment would actually have been defeated because it wasn't clear enough.
But you voted for something that you don't know the substance of.
Well, we do know what we're sending her back to try and achieve with the EU.
Well,
we're not going to tie the Prime Minister's hand in exactly what that is.
What? Right.
So you have to remove the backstop. That is clearly, and it has to be legally binding. That is clear. So if those two things are achieved, she's got every chance of getting it through the House of Commons.
What are these alternative arrangements? That is what this all hinges on. Theresa May has said she will reopen the withdrawal agreement, despite Europe saying that is absolutely not going to happen. What are the alternative arrangements?
Well, I think the EU's sticking very rigidly to their position. You'd expect that. We heard from Macron at the top of the programme. But I think they're also saying, and they were briefing over the weekend, that actually they were willing to reopen the withdrawal agreement if the EU's red lines moved. That was a briefing coming out of Juncker's office. So it can't both be the case that the withdrawal
agreement... If the UK moves their red lines.
Fine, but then it's not true that the withdrawal agreement is locked down. So I think whatever the actual agreement is found, I think that the key is it's legally binding and it offers the UK the surety that we can't be trapped in the backstop. So the EU is saying there are no alternatives to the backstop. Fine. But in that case, they shouldn't have signed a withdrawal agreement that commits them to finding alternative solutions. If there are no alternative solutions, the UK is right to see the backstop as a trap.
Do you accept now that there is a majority for something along the lines of Theresa May's deal? That was proven by last night's votes, and there wasn't a majority support for what you would like to see.
There was a majority against the backstop, and then there was an utterly nebulous and meaningless phrase, we want alternative arrangements. We are 2 months from leaving the EU with no deal at all, and Theresa May is being sent back to Brussels with this laundry list of complete and utter nonsense. What the EU is saying is, we will not reopen the withdrawal agreement, but the political declaration on the future relationship is absolutely up for grabs. What you need is to pivot to a Norway Plus style arrangement within the political declaration. The backstop therefore falls away. You have a parliamentary majority for it, and it is rapidly and smoothly acceptable to the European Union. That has always been the case.
All those amendments were rejected about having indicative votes to sort of test the temperature within Parliament. It was defeated in terms of calls for delaying Brexit and extending Article 50. Do you accept now that you have lost that battle to push on those?
Not at all, because the one thing that does change in all of this, you know, the nightmare of the roundabout keeps going, and Theresa May keeps going back on these completely fool's errands. But one thing that is changing is time. And as time ticks down, and as it becomes clear that Theresa May's deal is not going to go through because the EU will not shift on the backstop, then a cross-party consensus is the only way out of this. And I've been working closely with colleagues like Nick Bowles and Oliver Letwin and others on my side, Lucy Powell. This is, and it's definitely worth noting that this was mentioned by Jeremy Corbyn in his response to Theresa May yesterday. He paid tribute to the Norway Plus group for trying to find a constructive and viable and realistic way out of this.
He's not backing it.
I think it was very significant that he mentioned it in his response to Theresa May.
But he's not backing it, and even if he did, it probably wouldn't pass the Commons anyway. So I think we're in a position where the objective of a lot of the amendments yesterday was to seek an extension of Article 50. Now, you're complaining that Theresa May is now sent back with unclear objectives. Seeking an extension isn't easy either.
Not unclear. I think the point is that they're unachievable, is what many people think.
Unclear and unachievable.
Right, but we don't know what would happen if we even went and begged for an extension. The EU might say, by the way, you're not having a short extension. We're hearing that the EU might be asking for a much longer extension, up to 2 years. And I think MPs would be very wary about doing that.
Well, let's look at how realistic it is to try and secure a reopening of the withdrawal agreement and massive changes to the backstop. Let's have a look at Donald Tusk and what he said within about 6 minutes of the votes last night. He is the EU Council President. The backstop is part of the withdrawal agreement, and the withdrawal agreement is not open for renegotiation. What would you say to him?
I'd say that's exactly what I'd do if I was in his position. If you're in a negotiation, you're going to say exactly what you said before, and then you're going to compromise later on, and that's what will happen. And this may not be agreed until very close to the 29th of March.
And you're prepared to run it to then?
Well, that's not in my hands, it's not in the Prime Minister's hands, it's up to what the EU do. They have form on doing that.
Right, and it's true. Everybody talks about the 11th hour negotiations. No deal is very bad for the EU, particularly for Ireland.
The 11th hour passed in December. That's the thing that people don't understand. The withdrawal agreement is done and dusted. It's been agreed. The 1 minute to midnight passed months ago. So this isn't up for negotiation. What is up for negotiation is the political declaration on the future relationship. And I'm really quite exasperated by the failure of our government to get that simple message into their heads.
Laura?
I just think if you were the EU and you knew that in 2 weeks' time, around the 14th of February, MPs were going to have a chance to vote on all these things again, and that you might have a Cooper 2-style amendment that could delay Article 50, and who knows what comes after that, I don't think you would budge. I don't think you'll budge in the next 2 weeks.
And as one of your colleagues said, there's a 595-page odd-page treaty which has been agreed. The main issue is with 1 or 2 lines. And I think Peter has set out his very tough position. He may also need to compromise if what we can agree is not a change to the withdrawal agreement, but perhaps a separate mini-treaty that sets out the circumstances in which the UK could...
But I wouldn't say that now, would I?
But would you?
I might say that later on if it comes closer to the deadline. Who knows?
Right, so you could be persuaded on the basis of what can be achieved if they don't open the withdrawal agreement, but there is a legal addition, something that is legally binding, but is an addition to the withdrawal agreement. Would you accept it?
Well, I think what we're looking for is 98% of the Conservative MPs support the Prime Minister in her ambitions. Let's see if we can achieve it.
Right, do you think most of your colleagues would settle for that?
I think they're looking to... We want to do a deal, and we want it to be on the terms that the British people voted for, which is talked about it. If we can achieve that, I think people have already compromised. People will probably compromise again.
Right, so listening to that...
That's really interesting to me because, on the one hand, you have all this talk of something called a codicil, which could sit alongside the withdrawal agreement that basically sets out what both parties understand to mean, temporary is on the backstop. My understanding is that the ERG aren't totally clear on this. Is it the backstop totally removed from the withdrawal agreement? Could you accept, is that your number one priority? But would you accept something that sat alongside it that was legally binding, that set out something that's quite vague?
I think you make the first mistake. First of all, well, you make 2 mistakes. One, I'm not part of the ERG.
Which is the European Research Group of
which
Conservative MPs.
Is looked
but
as
anyway,
being this...
Yes.
But it's not. It's a loose association of levers, and there is not a whip on it. So people do what they think. So I think that's a misunderstanding that people have. And basically, what you had yesterday was extreme levers and extreme Remainers supporting the same thing. That is huge progress.
Right, and that is... Peter Bone is right in saying there was some unity, maybe for the first time within the Conservative Party. What happened to the Labour Party? They were whipped to support an amendment to delay Brexit and extend Article 50. 14 of your colleagues voted with the government, another 17 abstained.
Yeah, disappointing, and there's no other way of expressing that, because I think the fact is that even if we leave with a deal, we're going to have to extend Article 50 just to get the massive amount of legislation that we need to get through Parliament. But I think what we also, as Laura absolutely rightly pointed out, this is coming back on the 14th. The Yvette Cooper amendment will be retabled. The time ticks by. The unicorns in the Brexit fantasy forest keep getting hunted by Theresa May and the Brexiteers. Eventually, people will realise you're not going to catch any of those unicorns, and it's time to have some realism and some realpolitik.
Nobody will understand out there what you're talking about, unicorns. People just want Brexit and they want us to get on with it.
Yeah, of course. Well, I want Brexit as well. It's just a Brexit that's real and that has a chance of commanding a parliamentary majority.
Why don't you support what the government's doing then? You're trying to keep us in.
No, I'm not.
Yes, you are. That's what you want. Come on, be straightforward.
Is Norway a member state of the European Union?
And does it end free movement?
Yes, it does. With Article 112, it's emergency break.
That does not end free movement.
Well,
you know it doesn't.
I think it's. I mean, I think
free
it's
movement
time.
Of workers, but
I think it's time for some realism.
Right. You said that they may have to extend Article 50.
There might have to be a short technical extension of Article 50. But going back to something that was said a minute ago, I think the EU is in a very difficult position. Now, they may want to gamble and wait to see what happens on the 14th of February. But ultimately, they've misread British politics pretty profoundly before. And they were obviously gambling on the Cooper Amendment passing and the UK coming and begging for an extension. That isn't happening. The Prime Minister is right when she says the only way to stop no deal is to vote for a deal. The Labour frontbench whipped their MPs to vote for Article 50. That set in place a process that inexorably led to leaving with a default of no deal. The Prime Minister's got a deal. Let's support her in getting the changes that are needed so it can meet a majority support in the Commons.
What makes you think that another attempt at passing an amendment like Vet Cooper's to delay Brexit and extend Article 50 will get the support this time around?
Because the other vital vote yesterday was a majority in favour of not leaving the EU with no deal. And as the clock ticks down, it becomes very clear that the backstop's not going to change. And so the only way through this is to pivot to a form of Brexit that deals with the backstop, that has a political declaration that actually protects jobs and livelihoods, and that gets us out of this political and constitutional crisis. And I feel confident that colleagues on my side of the House, as we get closer and closer to the no-deal cliff edge, will realise that this is the only way through.
And also, one point to make is that there's been all this talk of ministers in the government resigning in order to vote for something that looked like a Cooper amendment. And ministers like Richard Harrington have decided not to because their rationale is that they can wait 2 weeks. So that's the crux point. Actually, then do you have members of the cabinet saying, well, this is the last time that we have to actually stop a no deal. Can I stay in the cabinet or will I have to resign to vote for it?
You're right, there's very strong concerns in the cabinet. But ultimately, it still takes us back to what are we actually asking for? If we get a 3-month extension, which is what the Labour Party tried to whip for on the Cooper Amendment, what does that give us? It doesn't solve the fundamental problems. It just pushes the cliff edge down.
Right.
And the EU may well say, no, you can only have an extension of 2 years.
Right, well, let's listen to the EU response, because the Deputy Prime Minister of Ireland, Simon Coveney, has said the Republic of Ireland will not approach the Brexit negotiations on the basis of threats. Theresa May's decision to ask the EU to reopen the Brexit deal is wishful thinking that will not work. We won't do it.
And that, of course, is where, in the Malthouse compromise, the Remainers and Leavers are coming behind something which would effectively stop the cliff edge. That is having what some people call a managed no deal, which is coming out on the 29th of March on a no deal, but buying a transition period of, in fact, actually on the compromise of 3 years, not 2 years. So all these things have been thought through. And if Remainers and Leavers can support that, I really don't understand why people of goodwill on the opposition can't. I think as you get closer to the date, many of your colleagues will say, we want to get an agreement. And they will actually support the government. I think if anyone's chasing unicorns, it may be you.
This idea of a managed no deal is a contradiction in terms. And if we don't have a deal by the 29th of March, there is no transition period, because the transition period is baked into the withdrawal agreement. It's not part of the political declaration. Managed no deal is a contradiction in terms. What we have to have now is a sensible, realistic, pragmatic way through this complete mess. And as it's absolutely clear, I think you've read 3 or 4 quotes now from Macron, from the Brussels, from Dublin. The withdrawal agreement is not going to be reopened.
Right, well,
so the backstop is the backstop.
Well,
That's it.
Peter has alluded to the fact that there may be a compromise, even if it's not actually in the withdrawal agreement itself. So what would the compromise be?
We need to work that out, and the Prime Minister can't just go with a series of suggestions next week. But what we saw last week was the EU getting a complete mess over what would actually happen in the event of no deal. On the one hand, they said there would be a hard border. The Irish Prime Minister said it would be a militarised hard border. Then they said there'd be no border. Then they suggested there might be a customs union between the 26 with checks going to Ireland. Which is it? I mean, I think that the EU haven't got their own position clear.
Right. I mean, would you accept a customs union, a permanent customs union, as a compromise for reopening the withdrawal agreement and having a replacement for the backstop?
There's no way the Conservative Party is going to support a customs union.
Right. So that is not even on the table.
Well, the Conservative Party also comprises people like Nick Boles, Oliver Letwin, all of those colleagues, Conservative colleagues, who are part of the Norway Plus group. Norway Plus says we want full membership of the single market through the European Economic Area, plus a form of customs union. They're all signed up to that. So they're backing Theresa May's deal. As and when it falls, they realise that we've got to pivot to something which is going to be deliverable. So I think there's plenty of Tory MPs who will pivot to this. If Labour is whipped to support it, it's also SNP policy. We have the numbers.
Right. Do you trust the Prime Minister?
Of course.
You do, despite the fact that she delayed and postponed a meaningful vote. She called an election that she said she wouldn't. Do you trust her when she says she will go back to Brussels and renegotiate the backstop?
Absolutely.
Right. I mean, on that, is there a problem, though, of bad faith in terms of the EU when Theresa May herself said very clearly this is non-negotiable?
I think there's a concern about trust on all sides, but the Prime Minister's tried her best through this process. I think the EU are now trying to pretend that this backstop is somehow a UK invention. That's ridiculous. They insisted on a phasing of the negotiations. They tried to ensure that we resolve the Irish border question in phase 1. That was in December. They insisted that we had the backstop to get to sufficient progress, and then they conceded at the last minute that they could have some fudge to allow a customs union to make it UK-wide, but the checks remain only Northern Ireland specific. This is a very big problem for the UK, and you look at what people like Lord Bew are saying, a crossbench peer, highly respected, that the backstop itself poses a threat to the Belfast Agreement, Good Friday Agreement, and needs to be looked at.
Right. I mean, Labour would want to reopen the withdrawal agreement themselves. Jeremy Corbyn has said we could negotiate a better deal, which would involve renegotiating the withdrawal agreement.
No, the political declaration. If you're talking about a customs union, that's the future relationship. What we've said is we want a customs union and a strong single market deal. That's all about the future relationship. What you do is make a very clear and specific commitment in the political declaration on the future relationship, which would be politically binding for any government going forward, to negotiate the final deal with the European Union by the end of the transition period, which enables the backstop to fall away. So it's a very logical position. The other point I'd make is the backstop is what the British have negotiated, because Theresa May spent 18 months through the pain of this withdrawal agreement. She voted last night against her own deal. I mean, this was a massive U-turn by her. She spent 18 months
on the back
of energy and political
change.
And the Brady Amendment is, in essence, a humiliation for the Prime Minister.
Right, but the Labour position is crazy. They're asking for a customs union. There's already a customs union at the heart of the backstop. That's why people like Peter don't like it. And they're also asking for a strong single market deal to avoid the need for checks, partial alignment with certain single market rules. That's been tried. It's called checkers, and the EU said no.
It's not called checkers because the European Economic Area is full.
Well, that's your policy, not the Labour policy.
Shared institutions, the agencies. Checkers was just a sticking plaster and would not have delivered frictionless trade on the Irish port.
That's not the front bench policy, though, is it?
Yeah, the front bench policy is a strong single market deal, meaning shared institutions and regulatory alignment. That's what, plus a customs union, is what deals.
So it's a unicorn that has to be negotiated in the future.
Right.
It's part of the political declaration.
How, though, should the Prime Minister approach the other direction that was given to her as a result of those amendments last night, Peter Bone, which was no deal shouldn't be an option?
Well, no, the bit that would have dealt with that was defeated in the House of Commons. Obviously, I think I'm right in saying this, that Stephen and I would like to see a deal, and I think most MPs would. So that was saying the obvious, and let's hope that's what we can achieve.
Right, but it can't be taken, as you say, it wasn't a binding motion in that sense, and it can't be taken off the table as a result.
I think a lot of parliamentarians are trying to have it both ways. They voted for Article 50 overwhelmingly, about 80% of the MPs, and now they're turning around and saying, I don't like this deal. Well, the problem is, the deal's going to look something like this. This is what the Prime Minister's negotiated. She should change it, she should tweak it, but it's not going to be fundamentally started from scratch.
All right, well, let's talk to Philip Lee, who is the chair of Right to Vote. Philip, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes? We can't see you just yet. But Philip, there you are.
Yes.
Conservative MP who resigned, actually, early on in the negotiations. Philip, what do you want to see happen now?
Well, look, I mean, last night was displacement activity, really. Nothing's changed. We were being asked to vote for an amendment which Brussels and Paris had already rejected. I mean, it really is. I mean, what the general public must think of all of this nonsense, I don't know. Fundamentally, the vote's going to come back, I think, on Valentine's Day. And if there is no change to the backstop, I presume Peter Bone and others will vote against the deal at that point, in which case we're going to be in the scenario of no deal being the legal default situation. And at that point, colleagues on the Conservative side, the Labour front bench, are going to have to decide which way forward, and I suspect it's either a softer Brexit will be attempted, which is what Stephen's been talking about, or we're going to go down a second referendum route.
Right,
other than
Philip,
that, it's no deal.
But there was a clear signal last night in those amendments that there is a majority now for something along the lines of Theresa May's deal if the withdrawal agreement can be reopened or changed, which you may say is impossible or unachievable. But do you accept that the Tory party was united last night?
I think that there was some faux unity last night, but it's easy to find a position that we can all agree on as a party, or the great majority can agree on. But if the reality is that it's going to be rejected, and that's in defence of Brussels, they've been pretty consistent on this, they're not opening the withdrawal agreement.
Well, they say that now.
But I know, but this is what they've always been saying. So I'm working on the basis of trusting the fact that they're not going to change their position. Because if they open it up, the Spanish will get upset about things. The idea that the 27 were really pleased with this withdrawal agreement, that's obviously not true. So the Commission will just conclude it isn't really worth opening it up because they know that it will unravel.
All right, we're going to say goodbye to the two of you, Peter and Stephen. Thank you very much.